Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I believe under the regular order that I would be recognized for up to 30 minutes, and if not, I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized.
Without objection.
Mr. President, with all the things that are going on right now, and I'm particularly interested in the hearing that we had yesterday on ISIS, that it was a big deal, and I applaud General Dempsey for his honesty in talking about how serious this war is that we're embarking on right now. The fact that we have, just imagine the ISIS has tripled in the last 3 months, up to now well over 30,000 troops with tanks, with heavy artillery. I mean, this is not, I know the president has tried to make people believe this is just another ragtag terrorist operation over there like Al-Qaeda or Taliban. It's not. This is war. This is a real serious thing that we're in the middle of, and I do applaud General Dempsey and also Secretary Hagel for their honesty in the committee hearing. It's a difficult thing for them, but when the president has talked about, you know, no troops on the ground, no troops on the ground, we know we already have troops on the ground. You know, I think the American people have had a wake-up call, and they understand now how serious this is. In fact, there are 2 polls out last week. One of them was a poll that 70% of the American people know that how serious this is, and the ISIS could affect and would affect and is affecting our homeland. And that was a big thing, that 70% of the people in America understand that. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal poll came out along with ABC, and they said the same thing. 70% of the people know that this is something that affects our homeland. When they talk about troops on the ground, I remember asking the question during that hearing yesterday. I said to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, I said, you know, if the president says no troops on the ground, what if one of our airstrikes, if something happens to one of those planes, and we have the problem of one of the pilots bailing out? Are you saying that we don't have troops on the ground to assure his or her safety? And he said, absolutely, we will. So the point is, that's been a question that people have to understand. This is war. We got to win it. We can't take another chance. That's not why I'm down here. I think because of the distractions of ISIS and all these other things, a lot of people have forgotten about one of the most serious problems that's hampering our economy, and that is what this president has done through the over-regulation that takes place. Since he first took office and failed to achieve his signature cap-and-trade legislation, he's been working tirelessly to try to do what he couldn't do through legislation with regulation. And the regulations receive most of the attention because they're the most expensive. You know, it first started in 2003. I remember so much down here. In 2003, at that time, Republicans were a majority. I chaired the committee that had the jurisdiction. And they started off in 2003 with the first cap-and-trade legislation. And we defeated it. And we defeated it ever since that time. And one reason we defeated it is because I was able to find out, and I didn't know this in the beginning. People said global warming is real, and so all these bad things, we're all going to die. And yet, from the cost we determined, and this came from not just me or just others that were disinterested, but universities like MIT came out with a study. The Wharton School of Economics came out with one, Charles Rivers, and they all had the cost of this cap and trade somewhere between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, every time I hear a large figure, I go out and look at our population in my state of Oklahoma and see what that cost means to a family. In my state of Oklahoma, $300 to $400 billion a year would be a permanent tax increase for the average family in Oklahoma that files a federal income tax of $3,000 a year. And so when we get to these numbers, we we look and we realize that this is going to be very, very expensive. And no one wants anything to do with greenhouse gas regulations when the cost is so high. And I'll show later on that it wouldn't accomplish anything anyway. And that's probably why the recent polls like Gallup poll on global warming, it's the bottom of the national priority list. In their last poll, it was a poll of the 15 most things to be concerned about, and that's in global warming and climate change, registered number 14 out of 15. And so people have understood. It's kind of like they've understood now what's going on with ISIS. They know what the truth is. The Pew Research Center showed that 53% of Americans either don't believe that global warming and climate change is occurring, or they say if it is, it's natural causes. And you know, and this has been going on. This is the thing that has bothered me. You know, I can remember, and I'm going from memory now, but I used to use the example back when we first started looking at this as to how this is a cycle that's been going on for recorded history. In 1895, we got into a cooling period. They were referring to as the Little Ice Age, I think at that time. I could be wrong on that, but anyway, that endured to 1918. Then in 1918, it turned into a warming time, and that went all the way up through 1945. Now, this is what's significant. In 1945, then we started another cooling term. Well, it happens that 1945 was the year that was recorded as the year when we had the highest amount of CO2 emissions. And that precipitated not a warming period, but a cooling period. And of course, that went on up to about 1975, then we went to another cycle, and now we're actually entering into a cooling area. I think everybody knows that. So, you know, God's still up there. We've always had these seasons, and people would just, you know, they'd like to think somehow it's man that's doing it. They don't want any progress. They don't want people to be able to generate electricity and energy to take care of our needs. And while my friends on the other side of the aisle act as though public debate has been settled on the issue, as obviously it's just the opposite of that. It probably explains why it's been difficult for Tom Steyer to raise the full $100 million that he promised to help Democrats win elections this fall. Now, you remember in February that he announced that he would put up $50 million of his own money, and he did. And then he would raise another $50 million. And it'd be $100 million that he would put in campaigns for members, for incumbents who would agree to try to resurrect the global warming issue, because it has died in the eyes of the American people, and try to stop the pipeline. Well, he did this, and the trouble is he's not able to raise the other $50 million. The last count was it's only $1.7 million that he's been able to raise from outside donors. Nonetheless, of course, he has his own $50 million. Regardless, we don't know that he's spending the money. We know he's spending the money he's got, even though he hasn't raised other money. And you can see on this chart a quote where he said, and this is a quote, and this is, yeah, that's a picture of him right there. That's Tom Steyer. Not a bad guy and all that, it's just he's far left and he's got a lot of money. He said, and this, it is true that we expect to be heavily involved in the midterm elections. We're looking at a bunch of races. My guess is that we'll end up being involved in 8 or more races. So Tom Steyer's goal is to, as I say, resurrect the global warming issue and try to stop the Keystone Pipeline. Now, I think it's an appropriate time to talk about the hypocrisy on the left over political spending. We spent all of last week debating a constitutional amendment to limit political speech that is currently protected under the First Amendment. And Democrats are talking about the Koch brothers and all of that, and they don't. And people are not aware that this type of activity with a man named Tom Steyer, by his own admission. Someone asked me the other day, and I think it was when we were down on the floor. I was the only Republican to come down. It was kind of fun. They were having their all-night session, and I made the statement down there. I said, you know, in case if there's anyone with insomnia at home who's not asleep yet, this is a good way to do it. But I made the comment that this is something that we know is going on. And I stated that with all these races that are out there, they are trying to do something in order to elect people to try to go back to what they failed to be able to get through. And I think it's appropriate time to talk about that hypocrisy. Recent news reports have surfaced and described the Democracy Alliance. That's an organization that aims to organize the policy objectives and funding streams of the left-wing liberal establishment. According to an internal memo that was leaked to the press a few weeks ago, the Democracy Alliance for the past 9 years, and I'm quoting now, has aligned donors, leaders in the progressive movement, that's liberal, and political infrastructure in order to achieve victories at the ballot box and in policy fights, including those for comprehensive health care reform and Supreme Court confirmations. And this influence is estimated to be between $600 and $700 million. The Washington Post just recently had this chart right here, and it's kind of hard to read, but in the Post it was obvious because each one of those dots is a liberal political organization, and they all join together, and that's called the Democracy Alliance. Again, this was in the, I think 161 plus 21, 182 organizations are a part of this alliance. And it details all of their agendas and what that are being coordinated for the Democratic political agenda by the Democracy Alliance. Now, you recognize most of the names on the list. It includes Center for American Progress, Media Matters, American Votes, and even Organizing for Action, which, incidentally, Mr. President, is President Obama's political arm, his campaign arm. In April, this group convened a secret meeting in Chicago to huddle with its deep-pocketed donors to craft a strategy and messaging for this coming year's elections. It was shrouded in secrecy, and the memo prepared for attendees. Now, these are all these people that you see on this that were to come in and meet in Chicago. Warned them of interacting with political reporters. In fact, it included a pages-long list of reporters who are expected to try to crash the conference along with the photos so folks could be on the watch for these people. The names of the people attending and involved were not given, not going to be disclosed to the public, nor would any details be released about the discussions that are taking place. Tom Steyer and the Democracy Alliance are acting like a kind of like a cult, even as the Democratic left pushes for the institution of a new constitutional amendment. We now know that initiative was nothing more than a political sham. At the end of the day, the liberal left wants an aggressive, secretive political machine operating on its behalf, and it looks like they have what they need in the Democracy Alliance. The key selling point for the Democracy Alliance pitch is, to its contributors, is the inseparable link to the deep in connections with the Obama White House administration. The Democracy Alliance firmly believes it is the driver's seat, it's in the driver's seat when it comes to setting policy for liberals in Washington, and it wants its donors to know it. You know, there's nothing wrong with this. You know, we've had difference of opinion and philosophy. That's why we have political parties. This is more extreme than anything I've seen and more organized. One of their key goals of the Democracy Alliance is to promote, quote, an environment that keeps kids safe, unquote. This explains why the administration continues to push an extremist agenda of environmental mandates that will crush our economy. And this is where Tom Steyer has really succeeded in being a part of the Democracy Alliance. He's managed to convince Democrats in the Senate to hold more than one all-night vigil on global warming, and these have come as the United States has been enduring one of its coldest years yet. Just this month so far, NOAA at the Commerce Department has reported 246 record cold temperatures. Wyoming already has, right now, 20 inches of snow in some places, and it is unseasonably cold here in Washington. One of these colder areas, my city of Tulsa, Oklahoma. where on Saturday we set a record cool high temperature. It only got up to 62 degrees. That's never happened before. So that's not cooperating very well with people trying to convince people that the world is coming to an end because of global warming. It also explains why the president is continuing to aggressively implement greenhouse gas regulations after failing to accomplish this goal legislatively. These regulations will effectively prevent any new coal-fired power plant from being constructed and force our nation into rely substantially on expensive renewable sources. Regulations like these will take us in the direction of Europe, which in many places has experienced electricity prices 3 times as high as they are here in the United States. You see, they've been ahead of us in trying to stop fossil fuels and trying to stop nuclear energy. And their rates that their people are paying are now 3 times higher than ours. But this is a good one here. If anyone doubts that these rules will have a negative impact on our economy, just look at Australia. Australia imposed a carbon tax on their economy a few years ago, and it caused horrendous damage. It caused $9 billion in lost economic activity a year and destroyed tens of thousands of jobs. This is in Australia. This just happened. It was so bad that the government in Australia recently voted to repeal the carbon tax. Remember all the talk about the fact, oh, Australia's leading the way, they're going to have a carbon tax, we should be following them. Now they have just repealed that by an overwhelming vote, and their economy is now better for it. In fact, it was just announced last week that Australia experienced record job growth last month of 121,000 jobs. Now, they said this is because they've repealed this carbon tax that they had passed. Now, they credit the repeal to this success to the repeal of carbon tax. In addition to these greenhouse gas regulations, I think it's important for us to recall the many other regulations this administration, the Obama administration, has already imposed on the American people, and discuss all of the new regulations that have not yet come out. But they're working on them. There are some of these regulations they're holding off until after the election so that people would not know the cost of the regulations, how many jobs are going to be lost. The first we need to remember is Utility MAC. By the way, MAC means maximum achievable control technology. In other words, what technology has told us we can do to try to control these releases. And so Utility MAC was the first one that they successfully passed. In this case, the EPA established a standard that was impossible for utilities to actually meet. This regulation is inappropriate under the Clean Air Act, and it is having a $100 billion annual impact on the economy and destroying 1.65 million jobs. They've already done it. They were able to pass that right down party lines, I might add. The EPA has also finalized similar regulations for industrial boilers and cement kilns. Together, those regulations are having an impact of more than $63 billion on the economy. By the way, no one's refuted these figures. $63 billion on the economy, and they have destroyed 800,000 jobs and may result in the shutdown of 18 cement plants around the country. In another section of the law, the EPA put a rule together knowing it would increase the cost of gasoline. The rule is known as the Tier 3 rule, and it regulates the amount of sulfur that can be in gasoline when it leaves the refinery. Tier 2 standards were put into place back in the early 2000s, and that resulted in a 90% decline in the sulfur content of gasoline by 2010. That's already behind us. That's been done, and it had a possible and measurable impact on the environment. The need for a Tier 3 standard is not articulated very well. In fact, EPA did not have any unique scientific data to support the key benefits of this rule, and the EPA ignored the fact that it would actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. So it's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions, but the rule they're still putting forth, and it would be counterproductive to their other policies. The EPA stated blatantly that, and this is a quote, this rule, now we're talking about the Tier 3 rule, this rule will increase the cost of gasoline. And those are actually their quotes behind me. Furthermore, the EPA recently finalized a rule called the 316B water rule. This rule regulates the cooling water systems that are used by power plants and other major industrial facilities to prevent their operations from overheating. So they use water. The EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service were worried about the impact these facilities are having on fish, and so they put out a rule to help. In the rulemaking, EPA again states that, as it's stated back up here, the final rule will increase electricity costs. Worse is the fact that EPA could not even fudge its numbers enough to present a positive cost-benefit ratio. In its final rule, the stated costs are $300 million, which is about 10 times the estimated benefits of the rule, which are only $28.6 million. This violates the President's own Executive Order 13563, which states that agencies must, quote, propose or adopt a regulation only upon a reasonable determination that its benefits justify its costs, which is another problem we have with this administration. They'll have rules, they'll have laws, and they violate these laws, just like when he turned loose the 5 terrorists from Gitmo. And we had knowing that he was going to try to get rid of people in Gitmo, he took the 5 that were the very worst. And we had passed a law saying that he can't do that until he gives the Senate Armed Services Committee 30 days notice and gives us a chance to respond and stop him from doing it. He totally ignored it, just like he ignored these regulations. And worse yet, this rule has no human health benefits. Its only beneficiaries are fish. So EPA is putting out a rule that will increase electricity costs, including for those who live on fixed incomes, all for the sake of saving a few fish. Another rule EPA has done since the President Obama began his administration is the Regional Haze Rule. These regulations were established to improve the visibility of national parks, and states were instructed to develop their own plans known as state implementation plans in order to comply. Oklahoma did this. My state of Oklahoma did this, but the EPA overturned it because of a technicality associated with the economic analysis. When EPA did this, it instituted a federal implementation plan. And in this case, it cost over $1 billion to execute, or nearly 10 times the amount of the state-based plan that had been developed cooperatively with our utility companies. This is the kind of uncooperative relationship we've come to expect when working with the EPA. Beyond the greenhouse gas regulations, the one receiving the most attention is the waters of the United States rule. Nearly every group in Oklahoma is talking about this rule because it will extend the power of the federal government over millions of new acres of land. I just got back. Last week I was in Guymon, Oklahoma, El Reno, Oklahoma. Boise City, Oklahoma is the furthest west large city out in the Panhandle. It's kind of sandwiched between Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, and Texas. And they're all in western Oklahoma. This is an arid part of the country. They're in the 3rd year of their drought right now, but the new rule would declare much of this area as a federal waterway, subject to the owner's federal regulations. This would impact every industry: farming, ranching, oil and gas, construction, transportation, everything. The rule confirms, and this is interesting because Tom Buchanan happens to be the president of the Oklahoma Farm Bureau, and I asked him the question in a kind of a town hall setting that we had not too long ago. I said, you know, what is the biggest problem that we have in agriculture in Oklahoma? He said the biggest problem has nothing to do with the Farm Bill. The biggest problem we're facing right now is the overregulation by the EPA, what they're doing with their endangered species, what they're doing with containment of fuel on farms, what they're doing with the water rules that they have. And so he said that is the biggest problem. And I was with Terry Dietrich. He's the president of the American Farmers and Ranchers, and he agrees that the biggest problem that farmers in America are having right now is the overregulation of the EPA. EPA says that it will work with industries to make sure it works for them. But we know from experience that's not going to be possible. It's not going to happen. Their goal is to take over, it's to control, they leave no room for negotiation. Another devastating regulation developed by the EPA is the ozone NAAQS standard. Now, NAAQS means National Ambient Air Quality Standard. Now, it was last set at the end of the Bush administration at 75 parts per billion. The EPA has been working since President Obama took over the White House to lower this standard. In 2011, the president canceled EPA's plans to lower the ozone standard because it was going to hurt his re-election chances. But now that he's secured that re-election, he's ready to start it up again. The EPA staff and the Clean Water Scientific Advisory Committee, that's KSAC, a part of government, recently recommended that the administrator propose to lower the NAAQS level to between 60 and 70 parts per billion. This chart shows how much of the nation would be out of attainment if the EPA lowers the standard to 60 parts per billion. In Oklahoma, all 77 counties would be out of attainment. What does that mean? That means when I was mayor of the city of Tulsa once when it was out of attainment. We were not able to have any increase populations in many of our businesses. It essentially means that the EPA will have to issue a regulatory permit for any business expansion plans that could increase emission levels. It would make business expansion enormously expensive and would dramatically increase the power of the EPA. Now, all told, this rule would put nearly 94% of the county's population out of attainment. That's 94% of the counties in the United States of America. And the zones would cede our economic superiority to the likes of China and India. Zooming into more industry-focused regulations, the EPA has been the main culprit in the president's war on fossil fuels. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling have opened up dramatic new oil and natural gas resources in this country, and no one thought we'd ever be able to profitably extract these. Now through these and other new efforts that they have developed by the way, hydraulic fracturing was actually developed in my state of Oklahoma, in Duncan, Oklahoma in 1948. So this is something that is going on. But in spite of this, they're trying to use hydraulic fracturing to stop the successful increases that we've been able to have in the wells. We had, I remember asking Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson was the EPA director, the first one under Barack Obama. And I asked her the question, I said, if we were to pass any of these, or do something with hydraulic fracturing, has there ever been a documented case in the United States that hydraulic fracturing is damaging to groundwater? And she said, no, it's not. There's never been, the exact words she used was any proven case where the fracking process itself has affected water. So if you eliminate this, it's not going to save anything. You're still not going to have, because it's not creating any problem. And this doesn't come from me. It comes from the administrator of the EPA appointed by President Obama. Now, regardless, the EPA is moving full force to regulate hydraulic fracturing. At one point during the administration, there are a total of 13 different agencies working to do this. The Bureau of Land Management is one of them, and it's my understanding that their regulations are being finalized. It could cost producers as much as $100,000 per well. Now, keep in mind, every time they talk about what it's going to cost industry or business, that is passed on to the public. The EPA is also working to regulate methane emissions from across the oil and natural gas industry, whether it's the upstream producers during the drilling and the completion process, the midstream pipeline operators, or downstream retail distributors. EPA is convinced that the industry is willingly allowing their valuable product to seep into the atmosphere without any concern or awareness. EPA's methane strategy is part of the President's overall climate change action plan. The agency recently published white papers outlining its understanding of methane leaks in the industry. And they were not very impressive. I recently wrote EPA and the White House to express my concern with these papers, I was shocked that the papers seemed to lack any comprehensive understanding of the industry's operational practices. I was also disappointed the EPA didn't consider the many regulatory hurdles in place which actually prevent producers from installing the technology and infrastructure that would reduce methane emissions. And I'm hopeful that the EPA will take my recommendations seriously before moving forward. So we have two problems. I mean, right now, we could be totally independent of any other country. All we have to do is do what every other country in the world does, and that is exploit your own resources. And this president has made it impossible for us to get into public lands and to get this done. And then of course, you have the problem of the overregulation. So in all, the administration's regulatory agenda is intended to shut down the engine of America's economy. They've already shut down coal. Now they're working on oil and natural gas. What they've done so far is just a preview. But the liberal environmentalists, the Tom Steyers, the Bill McKibben, the Democracy Alliance must all be frustrated by what's going on right now. Temperatures are not going up, they're going down. Nobody seems to care. No one has any desire to implement the policies they want. The polling is all showing that they've lost this battle. That's exactly why we're willing to spend they're willing to spend between $600 and $700 million in this year's elections to convince the American people to elect members who will support the president's regulations, which will shut down the economy. You know, one more thing, and I'll wind up, but going back to the global warming thing. Earlier I said that back in 2002, when we discussed the cost it would be between $300 and $400 billion as the largest tax increase in history, a permanent tax increase. I asked the question to Lisa Jackson again. She was the administrator of the EPA, appointed by Barack Obama. I said, if we were to pass any of these cap and trade regulations or bills or do it by regulation, would this have the result of lowering CO2 emissions worldwide? And she said no, because this isn't where the problem is. So the problem is in China, it's in India, it's in Mexico, it's in other places. In fact, you could use the argument that it would actually have the effect of increasing emissions, because as we chase away our base, the manufacturing base will go to countries like China and India, where they don't have any restrictions on emissions at all. So there we get the largest tax increase in history and no reduction in CO2. So with that, I think it's important, Mr. President, to remind the people, even though that era is almost gone, the people realize that that's something that was very popular at one time. Now the polls show that people have caught on. But still, you have to keep in mind that what the president could not do through legislation, he is now doing through regulations. And regulations, as I pointed out, is the greatest problem our economy is facing today. And this is something we're going to have to change. And with that, I will yield the floor and suggest the episode.